The day Lillian Whitaker rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1879, she did so with a loaded rifle across her saddle, a worn leather satchel full of medicinal herbs, and absolutely no intention of staying longer than it took to restock her supplies and move on. Caldwell was a cattle town on the edge of the Cherokee Strip, the kind of place where the wind never stopped and neither did the trouble. The main street was wide and dusty, bookended by a pair of saloons on either end, with a dry goods store, a livery stable, a small church that nobody seemed to use on the weekdays, and a barber shop in between. The smell of cattle was ever present, riding in on every gust from the south, and the sound of boot spurs on wooden boardwalks was a constant percussion beneath the murmur of the town. Lillian was 26 years old, and she had been on her own since she was 19. She was not a delicate woman, though she was handsome in a way that drew eyes without asking for them. Her dark auburn hair was pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and her green eyes had the kind of steadiness that made people uncomfortable if they tried to stare too long. She wore a practical canvas duster over a plain cotton dress, and her boots were scuffed from months of hard riding. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a traveling herbalist and healer named Lillian Whitaker, who had taught her that a woman's knowledge was her greatest currency. When Rosalie died of a fever in the winter of 1872, Lillian had inherited the practice, the wagon, and the unshakable understanding that she could survive anything if she kept her head and her hands busy. She had spent the years since moving town to town through the Kansas plains, offering remedies for fever, poultices for wounds, teas for those whose lungs had gone bad from the dust, and quiet company for the dying. She asked only fair payment, never stayed long enough to be owed something she could not repay, and did not entangle herself in anyone else's story long enough to become part of it. She had made a deliberate art of passing through. The livery stable on the east end of Caldwell was run by an old man named Gus Mercer, who had hands like tree bark and a slow, thoughtful way of speaking that Lillian had always respected. She had passed through Caldwell twice before, the last time nearly 2 years ago, and Gus had not forgotten her. "Miss Whitaker," he said, coming out from the shadows of the stable with the same unhurried manner he always had. "Back through, are you?" "Just for the night," she said, swinging down from her mare a gray animal named Clover. "Can you take her? She needs her left rear shoe checked. I think she threw it loose sometime this morning." "Sure can," Gus said, taking the reins and running a practiced hand down Clover's flank. "You heading north or south?" "South," Lillian said. "There's a settlement near the Cimarron I heard needs a healer. Somebody's down with a stomach sickness that won't pass." Gus nodded, clicking his tongue at the mare. "You planning to eat before you go? Pearl's got beans and cornbread over at the boarding house. Good food, and she don't overcharge." "I remember Pearl's place," Lillian said. She pulled her satchel from the saddle and settled it on her shoulder. "I'll be back for Clover in the morning." She went first to the dry goods store, where a woman named Helen Tarr ran things with brisk efficiency and a general air of having seen everything twice. Lillian bought dried beans, a tin of lard, a paper of salt, a small bottle of laudanum for the settlement medicine kit, and 2 yards of clean muslin that she could use as bandaging. She paid for it all in coin without complaint, tucked her purchases into her satchel, and stepped back out into the warm evening air. The sun was sitting low over the flat western horizon, and the sky had gone the particular shade of orange and violet that the Kansas plains produced better than anywhere else Lillian had ever traveled. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment and simply breathed it in, the way she always did when the day softened. It was the one indulgence she allowed herself. It was in that moment of stillness that she first saw Levi Turner. He came from the direction of the saloon called the Golden Bit, and he was moving with the particular purposefulness of a man who had somewhere to be, that he was not entirely glad about. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark brown hair gone a little long at the collar and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He wore a plainsman's coat, trail-worn and the color of tobacco leaf, and his hat was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he had forgotten it was there. There was a star pinned to his coat which made Lillian look twice. A lawman. A deputy's badge, she thought, though the town's light was going fast. He was moving fast, and she was standing at the edge of the boardwalk, and neither of them saw the collision coming until it had already happened. Her satchel went one way, his hat went the other, and Lillian stumbled back 2 steps before catching herself against a post. "Ma'am," he said immediately, reaching down to collect his hat with one hand and her fallen satchel with the other. "I am sorry. I wasn't watching where I was going." "Neither was I," she said, which was true and which she said only because it was. She took the satchel from his extended hand. "No harm done." He straightened up and settled his hat back on his head, and she noticed then that he had dark eyes, very dark, almost black in the fading light, and that there was something in his expression that was both tired and alert at the same time, the look of a man who had not been sleeping well but could not afford to stop paying attention. "Levi Turner," he said, because apparently he was the kind of man who introduced himself after running into strangers. He did not extend a hand for a shake, perhaps because hers was full, but he nodded once, with a kind of directness that she found oddly pleasant. "Lillian Whitaker," she said, "passing through." "As always," she said. He nodded again, as if that made perfect sense, and then he did something she had not expected. Instead of moving on with whatever urgent errand had been driving him down the street, he paused. Not in a leering way, not in the way some men did when they had decided a woman alone was fair game for attention. He paused the way a person pauses when they are not quite done with a moment. "You're a healer," he said, looking at the satchel with its shape of bottles and cloth. "I can smell the yarrow." She raised an eyebrow. "Most people can't name it." "My mother used it for everything," he said, and something passed over his face then, quick and private, and she chose not to press it. "Do you have anything for a man who's been shot in the shoulder and won't stop telling everyone he's fine?" Lillian looked at him more carefully. "Is that man you?" "No," he said, and there was the faintest ghost of something that might have been a smile. "That man is my deputy. He took a bullet 3 days ago from a cattle thief who I am now very much looking for, and he keeps insisting the wound is clean when I am not convinced it is." "Where is he?" "Boarding house," he said. "Pearls." "I was going there anyway," Lillian said. "Take me to him." He did, and that was how it began. The man in question was a young deputy named Court Hadley, who was perhaps 22, and who had the sunburned, stubborn look of someone who had grown up working hard land, and had never learned to accept help gracefully. He was sitting up in his bed at Pearl Garrity's boarding house with his arm in a sling and his shirt off, trying to read a newspaper with his good hand, and doing a credible impression of a man in no distress whatsoever. Lillian looked at the wound for approximately 4 seconds before she said, "This is infected." "It's not," Court said. "The redness goes out 2 inches from the entry point and the skin is hot," she said, already pulling items from her satchel. "It is infected. Not badly, not yet, but if you had left it another 2 days, you would have been in serious trouble." Court looked at Levi, who shrugged in a way that said he had told him so without using any words at all. Lillian cleaned the wound with water and an herb-steeped solution she had prepared for exactly this kind of thing, applied a drawing poultice that she made fresh from the supplies she had just purchased, and wrapped it in clean muslin. She instructed him to keep it elevated, to drink plenty of water, and to not use that arm for at least a week. She left him a small tin of dried willow bark tea for the fever that might come. Court, for all his stubbornness, thanked her with genuine sincerity by the end of it. She suspected the relief of having someone finally look at the thing properly had been considerable. Levi paid her from his own pocket, and she told him the price was fair and thanked him for not arguing it down the way some men did when they thought a woman's work was worth less than a man's. He gave her a look that was both startled and amused. "I wouldn't do that," he said. "Most men would," she said. "Then most men are fools," he said simply, and put his hat back on. She ate dinner at Pearl Garrity's long table with 6 other boarders and travelers, and Levi Turner was among them, and he sat at the far end of the table and did not make any effort to sit near her or to continue a conversation, which she found herself noticing more than she expected to. He ate with the focused economy of a man who had spent a long time eating on the trail. He listened more than he talked. When others spoke, he watched them with the same quiet alertness that she had noticed on the street, and she thought that he was probably very good at his job, that he saw things that other people thought they had hidden. She told herself she was simply making professional observations. She told herself that he was simply a lawman doing his job in a cattle town, and she was simply a healer passing through, and by morning she would be gone and none of this would be anything at all. She had told herself similar things before and had always been right. She saw no reason this time should be different. After dinner, Pearl served coffee at the table, and two of the boarders played cards, and the evening settled into the loose, comfortable ease of a place that took in strangers without asking too much of them. Lillian sat by the window with her small leather journal, updating her notes on the herbs she still needed to replenish before she left Caldwell. "It's in the Cimarron settlement," Levi asked. She looked up. He was seated across the room, coffee cup in hand, and he had spoken in a low voice so as not to disturb the card game. "A family named Dawes," she said, "and some others, maybe 30 people altogether. Someone sent word up the trail that the Dawes children had a stomach sickness that hadn't cleared." "How long have you been traveling this way?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not an intrusive one. He was not leaning in or pressing. He asked it the same way he might ask about the weather, which was, she realized, its own kind of skill. 7 years, she said. "Alone." "Mostly," she said. "I have a mare." He nodded. "You know the country south of here?" "Well enough," she said. "I've crossed the Strip before." "There's been trouble south," he said, not alarmingly but with the directness of someone who thought she ought to have complete information. "The man who shot Court was riding with a small outfit, 3 or 4 men. They've been hitting homesteaders and travelers between here and the river. We think they're moving south." Lillian looked at him steadily. "Are you warning me off?" "I'm giving you information," he said. "What you do with it is your own decision." She appreciated that. She genuinely did. "I've dealt with difficult men before," she said. "I don't doubt it," he said, and there was nothing condescending in his voice, nothing that suggested he was humoring her. He believed her and he moved on. "But knowing the trail is one thing. Having someone who knows where they're likely to camp is another." "Are you offering to ride with me?" She said it levelly, without invitation or rejection, simply checking the facts as she understood them. He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression shifted, became more considered. "I need to go south anyway," he said. "I'm tracking the man who shot Court. His name is Dalton Reese, and the last word I had put him heading toward the Strip. If our paths are going the same direction, riding together makes sense." "It does," she allowed, "but I ride at dawn and I set my own pace." "So do I," he said. "We can figure out the pace between us." She thought about it. She weighed it with the same practical mind that weighed every decision she made. The safety of the Dawes family against the risk of riding with an unknown man. The value of having a lawman's presence on a troubled trail against the cost of being in someone else's company for longer than a night. She had traveled alone for 7 years. She had learned to read people quickly and accurately, because her survival had sometimes depended on it. And what she read in Levi Turner was a man who was straightforward, who was tired in ways that went deeper than sleep, and who was not the kind of person who would make her companionship into something it was not meant to be. "Dawn, then," she said. He nodded once, finished his coffee, and said good night to the room. She stayed by the window a while longer after he had gone up the stairs to whatever room Pearl had given him, and she watched the dark street of Caldwell and thought about the coincidence of running into someone in a doorway, and how the world sometimes seemed to arrange things with a kind of casual neatness that you could choose to notice or not. She chose, for now, to simply note it and move on. She was good at that. They set out at dawn as agreed, when Caldwell Street was still empty, and the air had the clean, cool quality of early morning on the plains that always made Lillian feel as if the world had been temporarily simplified to its essential parts. Sky, grass, distance. Levi Turner was waiting at the livery with his horse already saddled, a deep-chested buckskin that looked as trail-hardened as he was. He had a bedroll and a rifle, and not much else. He tipped his hat when she came out of the stable with Clover and said good morning without ceremony, and they rode out of Caldwell heading south without any particular fanfare or conversation. She appreciated that too. There were men who filled silence the way water filled a vessel, because they were uncomfortable with any space that was not occupied. Levi Turner was not one of them. He rode easy, one hand on the reins, scanning the horizon with those dark eyes in a way that was habitual rather than anxious, the practiced surveillance of someone who had spent a long time in country that required attention. The Cherokee Strip was a stretch of land south of Kansas that the Cherokee Nation held under a lease arrangement, a corridor of open grassland that cattle herds moved through on their way north from Texas to the Kansas railheads. It was contested in ways that were both political and physical, the subject of legal disputes that Lillian thought were fundamentally unjust. The land had been taken from the Cherokee by treaty alterations and federal pressure, and what they had been left with was being further squeezed by cattlemen and settlers who treated the Strip as if it were simply unclaimed frontier rather than land belonging to people who had already been displaced once from their homelands further east. She had strong feelings about this, and she was not in the habit of keeping them quiet when someone asked. About 2 hours into the ride, as they dropped into a long, shallow valley where the buffalo grass ran thick and golden in the morning light, Levi said, "You seem comfortable with this country." "I've ridden it a lot," she said. "I've talked to enough Cherokee riders to know the trails. They've been fair with me when I was in their territory, more than fair." "They have reason not to trust white travelers," he said. "They do," she agreed. "The way they've been treated is a wrong that nobody in this country seems particularly interested in making right." She glanced at him. "Does that bother you, me saying that?" "No," he said without hesitation. "It's true." He shifted in the saddle. "My job is to keep order in Caldwell and its surrounds. Most of what that means is keeping cattle thieves from ruining the livelihoods of honest people, keeping the peace in a town where everybody's armed, and trying not to shoot anyone I don't have a very good reason to shoot. I don't have much influence over the bigger questions." "But you think about them," she said. It was not quite a question. He glanced at her. "Yes," he said. "I think about a lot of things." They rode in silence for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. The plains opened up around them, vast and windswept, and the sky was enormous overhead, the kind of sky that made you feel very small and very free at the same time, which Lillian had always thought was the essential paradox of the West. They stopped at midday to water the horses at a creek that cut through the bottom of a low ravine, willows trailing their long fingers in the current, the water running clear and cold over smooth stones. Lillian picketed Clover in the shade and got out the food she had brought from Caldwell, dried beef and biscuits, and a small tin of preserved peaches that she had been saving, and she split it with him without asking, because it seemed like the practical thing to do, and he accepted it without making it into something. "What's your situation in Caldwell?" she asked, because she was curious, and because asking things directly had always served her better than wondering about them privately. He was quiet for a moment, eating a piece of the dried beef with the methodical attention of someone who was not tasting it but merely fueling. "I've been deputy sheriff there for 4 years, he said. "Sheriff Baines runs the town. He's a fair man. I do most of the field work." "Do you like it?" "Sometimes," he said. "I like the work. I'm good at it. I don't like that it's mostly tracking down men who have made bad choices when I can see the shape of what led them to it and knowing that locking them up won't change the shape." "That's a complicated way to think about the law," she said. "Is it wrong?" he asked. And there was something genuine in the question, as if he actually wanted to know what she thought. "No," she said. "I think it's honest." He nodded slowly. "What about you?" he asked. "What made you choose this life?" she told him about her mother. About Rosalie Whitaker, with her collection of dried plants and her battered mortar and pestle, who had traveled the Missouri hills and hollers offering remedies to people who had no doctors within 30 miles, who had died doing work she loved, and who had passed that love on to her daughter along with the tools of the trade. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Levi said. "She was," Lillian said. She also thought that a woman needed a husband to manage her affairs, which was one of the few things she was wrong about. He looked at her with that quick, assessing look she was beginning to recognize. "She tried to marry you off." "Several times," Lillian said. "Before she died and after I was on my own for a while, there was no shortage of men in the country who thought a woman traveling alone was a problem to be solved by marrying her." She said it without bitterness, simply as fact. "I'm not the marrying kind. I never have been. I need my own movement, my own decisions, my own life." There was a pause. The water moved over the stones. Somewhere in the willows a meadowlark called. "Neither am I," he said. He said it quietly, without any particular weight, but she heard it land anyway, the way a stone drops into still water. "I had someone tell me once that I was married to the trail and the badge, and that there was no room for anything else. She was not wrong exactly. I just couldn't be what someone else needed me to be." She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a long time. The silence stretched between them like the plains, wide and open and full of things that had not yet been named. Then Clover stamped her foot against a fly, and the moment dissolved, and they both looked away with the deliberateness of people who have just noticed something they are not yet sure what to do with. "We should move," he said. "Yes," she agreed. They rode on. The trouble came that afternoon, as trouble in that country so often did, from a direction you were not quite watching. They were perhaps 3 miles from the Dawes settlement, which Lillian knew from the particular bend of a dry creek and a stand of cottonwoods that she had used as landmarks before, when Levi held up a hand. She stopped Clover. He was looking at something to the south and east, and she followed his gaze to where a thin column of smoke was rising from behind a low ridge. It was the wrong color and the wrong shape for a cooking fire. It was the kind of smoke that came from something that had been set burning on purpose. "That's where the Dawes place is," she said. Levi was already moving, and she was right behind him. They came over the ridge and down the other side at speed, and the sight that met them was not as bad as the smoke had suggested, but was bad enough. The Dawes barn was burning, a small structure half engulfed in orange flame. The farmhouse itself was intact, and standing between the house and the barn was a large man named Thomas Dawes, whom Lillian had met twice before, with his arms out and his expression one of barely controlled fury and fear. His wife Edna was behind him, and behind her 3 children of various ages clustered at the door. 2 men on horseback were between the Dawes family and the road. They looked hard-ridden and rough, the kind of men who had stopped caring about appearances sometime in the past year. One had a rifle across his saddle. The other had his hand on his belt where a revolver sat. Levi did not slow down until he was close enough for the situation to be read clearly, and then he pulled up and said, in a voice that was not loud but carried absolutely, "I am Deputy Sheriff Turner of Sumner County. You two need to put your hands where I can see them and step back from this family." The men looked at him. The one with the rifle, younger, maybe 25, with a lean, hungry look, shifted in the saddle but didn't raise the weapon. The other one was older, weathered, with a flat expression that Lillian did not like. "We're not doing anything," the older one said. "Just having a conversation." "A conversation that involved setting fire to a man's barn," Levi said. "I'll ask once more. Hands where I can see them." There was a tense moment where anything could have happened, and Lillian kept her own expression neutral and her hand loose at her side while she catalogued the situation and calculated what she could and could not do. She had a rifle in her saddle boot, and she knew how to use it. She was also very aware that escalating a confrontation was rarely the way to reduce it. The older man looked at her, then back at Levi, and then with the slow calculation of someone weighing odds, he raised his hands. The younger one followed a moment later, sullen and reluctant. "Smart," Levi said. He told them to dismount and put their weapons on the ground, and they did, and he had them sitting in the dirt with their hands visible while he talked to Thomas Dawes. The story came out in pieces. The two men were looking for someone who owed them money and had decided, with the logic of the desperate and the mean, that taking it out on the nearest available target was reasonable. They had been riding with a larger outfit but had split off. One of them, it emerged, was Dalton Reese's younger brother, which meant Levi had found at least one thread of the trail he was following. Levi bound the younger one's wrists with rawhide he had in his saddlebag, and told the older man he could either ride back to Caldwell ahead of them and present himself to the sheriff, or he could be bound and dragged. The older man chose to ride. While Levi handled this, Lillian went to the house. The Dawes children had the stomach sickness she had come for, as she had suspected, and it was what she had thought it was, a combination of bad water from a shallow well that had probably been contaminated from the spring overflow and the close quarters of a small house. She boiled water from a deeper well Thomas Dawes pointed her to, prepared a simple treatment of ginger and charcoal and clean fluids, and spoke to Edna Dawes about keeping the shallow well covered until it could be properly dug out. She spent 2 hours at the Dawes farmstead, enough to make sure the children were comfortable and that Edna understood the treatment. By the time she came back out, the barn was down to its stone foundation and a pile of smoldering timber, and Levi was standing near the corral fence, watching it burn itself out with the bucket brigade help of Thomas Dawes and the 2 older Dawes boys who were healthy enough to work. The younger man with the bound wrists was sitting against the corral post looking defeated. The older man had gone ahead as instructed. Levi looked at her when she came out. "How are they?" "The children will be fine," she said. 3 days of treatment and clean water and they'll be right. The baby had it worst, but she's not in danger." "Good," he said, and meant it. Thomas Dawes came to her after and pressed a small, folded amount of bills into her hand, and thanked her with the emphatic sincerity of a man whose relief was too large for his words. She thanked him back and told him to send word if the children didn't improve in 2 days. The Dawes family offered them a meal and a place to sleep for the night, and they accepted, both because it would have been rude to refuse, and because it was getting late in the afternoon and riding back toward Caldwell in fading light with a prisoner to manage was not ideal. Edna Dawes made a supper of salt pork and cornbread and dried apple pie, and they all sat around the Dawes table together in the warm lamplight. And there was something about the plainness and the realness of it that stayed in Lillian's chest long after it should have. The children, even sick ones, had the particular aliveness of children in small spaces, loud and warm and underfoot, and the smallest one, the baby Edna called Rosie, fell asleep in her mother's arms with the total surrender that only very small children can achieve. Lillian watched this and felt the particular bittersweet feeling she always did in such moments, not longing exactly, but awareness. She had chosen the life she was living with full intention. She did not regret it, but she was also not made of stone, and warmth was warmth, and she knew the difference between a choice and its cost. Across the table, she caught Levi looking at her with the same careful, quiet attention he seemed to bring to everything, and she held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at her food. Thomas Dawes gave her the smaller of the 2 back rooms. She did not know where Levi slept, but she heard the house go quiet around her and fell asleep to the sound of the wind off the strip and the distant complaint of a coyote. In the morning, they rode back north with the bound prisoner on a lead line and the older prisoner riding ahead in sullen silence. They turned both men over to Sheriff Baines in Caldwell before noon. Baines was a thick-necked, steady-tempered man who had been sheriff for a decade, and who took the prisoners with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen far worse and far better, and who told Levi that the information about Dalton Reese's brother might be useful in running the man down. Lillian stood in the street outside the sheriff's office and thought about what she was supposed to do next. Her business in the Cimarron settlement was done, at least for this visit. The Dawes family was seen to. Clover was rested and reshod. She had no reason to stay in Caldwell. She also had no particular reason to leave immediately, and she noticed, without fully examining it, that the thought of leaving felt different than it usually did. She went to Pearl Garrity's boarding house and asked for another night, and Pearl gave her the same room without comment, and with the additional gift of a clean towel and a bar of lavender soap. She was sitting on the narrow bed in the afternoon light, cleaning her supply kit and repacking it, when someone knocked at the door. She said, "Come in," and it was Levi. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at her with the directness that she had decided was simply the way he was, and he said, "I wanted to make sure you were all right. Yesterday was more eventful than you probably planned for." "I have had more eventful days," she said. "I know you have," he said. "That doesn't mean yesterday wasn't something." She looked at him. She set down the pouch of dried valerian she had been sorting. "I'm fine," she said. "Better than fine." "The children are going to be well." "Yes," he said, and then, after a pause that had the quality of a man choosing his words, "I've been thinking about," he looked at her steadily, "about the fact that Dalton Reese is still out there, and that his trail goes south, and that you travel south regularly, and that you travel alone, and that those things together are a concern I find I have." He paused again. "I'm also thinking about the fact that you told me you're not the marrying kind, and I told you I'm not either, and that what I'm about to say is not about that. But I find that I would like to keep your company a little longer than one ride to the Cimarron." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her chest that she identified and then firmly set aside to be examined later when she was alone. "You're asking to ride with me," she said. "I'm asking if you'd have me," he said, "on the trail, as a practical arrangement and because I want to." He said the last part quietly with a simplicity that cost him something, she could tell. He was not a man who said such things easily. She thought about it. She thought about the way the silence had settled between them at the creek, and the way he had watched her across the Dawes table, and the way he had said, "I'm giving you information, and what you do with it is your own decision," and the way he had not once, in 2 days of proximity, treated her as anything other than a capable person making her own choices. "My route goes south and then west," she said. "There's a settlement near Woodward that needs seeing to, and there's a woman in a homestead near the Cimarron crossing who is expecting her first child in the next month. I go where I'm needed." "I know," he said. "I can work that country. Reese is somewhere in it." "Then it seems practical," she said. He smiled then, just slightly, just enough that she saw it. "Practical," he said. "Yes." She pointed at the chair by the window. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me more about Reese and what I should know." He sat. He told her, and they talked until the supper bell rang. The days that followed were unlike any Lillian Whitaker had experienced in 7 years of solitary traveling, and she did not quite know what to do with that. She was used to making her own decisions without consultation, planning her route in her head without discussion, eating when she was hungry and resting when she was tired, and never having to consider whether another person's needs or preferences aligned with hers. With Levi, this was different, and oddly it was different in a way that did not chafe. He did not try to manage her. He did not second-guess her choices about where to stop or which trail to take or how to approach a sick family she had been called to see. He brought his own judgment to the trail and the tracking work, and he let her bring hers to everything else, and the 2 sets of judgment turned out to coexist without friction in a way that she found herself noticing with quiet surprise. He was also, she discovered over the days and then weeks of their riding together, genuinely funny in a dry, understated way that she had not expected. He said things so quietly and so calmly that it took a moment to realize they were jokes, and then she would find herself smiling when she had not planned to. He told stories about the years he had spent in Texas before coming to Kansas, working cattle drives up the Kisham Trail at 20 years old, and discovering that the romantic life of the cowboy was approximately 70% mud, 20% exhaustion, and 10% actual cattle work. He had seen enough of both the prairie and the people on it to have opinions about both, and his opinions were usually right. She told him things too, more than she usually told people, and she noticed this happening without being able to stop it. She told him about her favorite cure for a cracked winter lip that her mother had made from beeswax and calendula, and about the time she had spent a week in a Cherokee encampment east of the Strip, where an elder woman had taught her 3 plant remedies she had never encountered before, and that had since saved several lives. She told him about the things she missed about Missouri, which were few but specific: the smell of the creek in August, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the particular weight of fireflies in a summer evening. She told him, one night by a campfire when the stars were enormous and neither of them seemed to want to sleep, about the man she had briefly loved at 21, a printer's apprentice in a town she had passed through, who had asked her to stay and marry him, and had meant it with his whole heart, and who she had told no with her whole heart, and how leaving had been both the right decision and one that had cost her something that had never entirely grown back. Levi listened to this without interrupting, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think some things cost exactly what they're supposed to cost. That doesn't make the cost easier to pay." "No," she said. "It doesn't." The fire crackled. The horses moved on the picket line. The night pressed in, vast and dark and full of stars. "What was her name?" Lillian asked. She had been wondering since the creek, since he had said there was someone who told him he was married to the badge. He was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said. "She was a school teacher in a town called Medford down in the Oklahoma country. She was good and kind, and she deserved better than a man who was gone 4 months out of every 12 following a trail." "Did you love her?" "Yes," he said, "in the way you love something when you're 27 and you think love ought to be enough. I've learned since then that love is necessary but not sufficient. You also need to be the right people for each other. And you weren't." "We weren't," he said. "She married a hardware merchant the year after I left. I heard she has 2 daughters and a garden she's proud of. I hope it's true." "That's a generous way to feel about it," Lillian said. "She deserved better than what I could give her," he said. "It would be mean-spirited to be anything but glad she found it." She looked at his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself with a steadiness that was not rigid but rooted, like a tree that had bent in some storms and grown stronger for it. She thought about the person she was at 26, and about the choices she had made, and about the fact that she was sitting here, 7 years into a life she had built on purpose, feeling something she had not budgeted for. She told herself to be sensible. She told herself that what she was feeling was the warmth of good company on a long trail, the natural affinity between 2 people who were similarly made and similarly living. She told herself it was not love, because she did not fall in love with people she had known for 3 weeks on a trail south of Caldwell, Kansas. She told herself several other things as well, none of which were entirely convincing. The settlement near Woodward had a case she had not anticipated. The woman who had written to ask for a healer had a husband who had a badly infected leg wound from a fence accident, and the infection had advanced enough that she had to make a decision she always hated making, which was telling someone that the damage was serious and that they needed to travel to a proper doctor before gangrene set in. The man's name was Roy Adler, and he was a big, quiet homesteader who had come from Ohio and put 6 years of his life into the land he was working, and he went gray when she told him he needed to travel to Fort Supply where there was an army surgeon. His wife, May, a small woman with tired eyes and enormous reserves of quiet courage, took the information without flinching and began immediately planning what needed to be done. Lillian helped May make the preparations, showed her how to keep the wound clean and cool for the journey, and wrote out the instructions for the surgeon in the clear, detailed hand that she had developed over years of doing exactly this. She stayed at the Adler homestead for 2 nights, making sure Roy was stable enough to travel. Levi spent those 2 nights camping near the Adler property because the house was full, and on the second evening he helped Thomas Adler, Roy's teenage son, who was trying very hard to be the man of the household with his father unable to work, to repair a section of fence that had come down. She watched them from the house window, the tall man and the lanky boy, working together in the early evening light, and there was something in the way Levi worked alongside the boy without condescension, teaching rather than doing, that tightened something in her chest. She looked away. She went back to her work. They rode out of the Adler homestead on a clear morning, Roy and May and Thomas heading northeast toward Fort Supply in their wagon, and Lillian and Levi heading back south toward the Cimarron crossing. The woman near the river whose pregnancy Lillian had been tracking was named Helena Marsh, and from Lillian's calculations she was due within the next 3 weeks. "How long do you stay when someone is close to their time?" Levi asked. "As long as I'm needed," she said. "Sometimes that means waiting. I don't mind waiting. I usually have plenty to do." "And after?" She thought about the question. She usually knew after what she was going to do. She had a route, a circuit of settlements and homesteads and small towns that she revisited on a regular cycle, and the route told her what came after. But she was aware, riding through the warmth of the morning, that the circuit had started to feel less like a map and more like a habit, and she was not entirely sure when that shift had happened. "After, I'll head west," she said. "There's a settlement near the New Mexico border that I try to reach before the weather turns." "That's a long ride," he said. "It is," she said. He was quiet for a moment. They rode through a field of yellow coneflowers, vivid against the dry grass, and Clover picked her way with the careful precision she always used in flower-thick grass, lifting her feet high. "Lillian," he said. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, and there was something in the set of his jaw that told her he was working up to something. She had learned in weeks of riding beside him to read the small signals of his face and manner, and this was the signal of a man who was choosing words carefully because they mattered. "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly so there's no confusion about what I mean," he said. "Go ahead," she said. "I'm not trying to change who you are or what you do," he said. "I understand what your life is. I respect it. I have watched you work for 3 weeks, and I have seen a person who is exactly where she ought to be doing exactly what she was made to do, and it would be an arrogance to suggest that should be any different." He paused. "But I also know that I am not the same person I was before I ran into you on that boardwalk in Caldwell, and I would rather tell you that honestly than carry it without saying it." She was very still on Clover's back. The plains moved around them, all light and wind and the soft smell of the flowering grasses. "What are you telling me?" She said, not to make it harder for him but because she wanted to understand precisely. "I'm telling you that I find I care about you," he said. "Not in a way that makes demands, just in the way where it's true and I think you should know it." She breathed. She watched the horizon. She thought about 100 things simultaneously, about the life she had built, and the reason she had built it, and the way she had always believed that she was made for movement and for solitude, and for the particular freedom of belonging to no one and nothing but her own work. She thought about the printer's apprentice at 21, and the cost she had paid and had decided was right to pay. She thought about her mother and the mortar and pestle and the herbs drying in bundles, and about the way Levi had said his mother used yarrow for everything as if it were something he carried with him. "I care about you too," she said. She said it plainly, the same way she said everything, not decorated, not diminished. "I did not plan to." He finally looked at her then, and she looked back, and neither of them smiled because it was not quite the moment for smiling. It was the moment for something steadier and more serious than that. "I know," he said. "I'm still not the marrying kind," she said, because she needed to say it. because she needed them both to know that the truth of what she had said at the creek had not changed just because something else was also true. "I know that too," he said. "I told you I wasn't either." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give. I just wanted to stop pretending I didn't feel what I feel." They looked at each other for a long time, the horses moving slowly through the summer prairie, the sky immense above them, the world stripped down to its essentials. Something settled between them in that silence. Not a resolution exactly, not an agreement, but an acknowledgement. A truth that had been riding beside them for weeks and had finally been let into the conversation. She reached out across the space between their horses and put her hand briefly on his forearm, just for a moment, and then withdrew it. He looked at the place where her hand had been and then back at her face, and there was something in his eyes that made her feel as if she had been seen all the way down, not in a frightening way, but in the way that is only frightening until it happens, and then is simply a relief. They rode on. Helena Marsh was a 23-year-old woman who had come west from Illinois 2 years before with her husband James, who was 28, and who had the anxious, solicitous manner of a man who had been worrying about his wife's pregnancy since approximately the moment it started. He was a good man, Lillian had assessed on her first visit, just a nervous one. The Marsh homestead was a snug little place near the Cimarron, better built than many Lillian had seen, with a proper root cellar and a kitchen garden and a well that ran sweet. Helena was waiting for them on the porch when they rode up, round and calm, with the particular serenity that some women in late pregnancy achieved, a kind of inwardness that Lillian had always respected. Lillian dismounted and went straight to her and took her hands and looked at her. "How are you feeling?" "Good," Helena said. "Tired, but good. The baby's been moving a lot." "That's good," Lillian said. "That's what you want." James Marsh appeared in the doorway behind his wife and saw Levi Turner and visibly relaxed, because having a lawman on the property when his wife was 3 weeks from delivery was the kind of thing that made a nervous husband feel better about the state of the world. Lillian stayed with the Marsh family and settled into the pattern she always fell into at a homestead where she was waiting out a birth. She checked on Helena every morning and every evening, monitored her progress, made sure she was eating and resting and drinking enough water. She organized Helena's supply of birth materials, the clean cloths and the oil and the cord-tying thread and the other necessaries, and she talked to Helena about what to expect in the plain, honest way that she had found women almost always preferred over softened versions. "Are you frightened?" Lillian asked her one afternoon, sitting with her on the porch while the sun went down. "Yes," Helena said, "but not as much as I was. I feel like I know what's coming." "You do," Lillian said. "As much as anyone can, and I'll be right here." Helena squeezed her hand. "I'm glad you came." "So am I," Lillian said, and meant it. Levi, meanwhile, had found something to make himself useful with, which she had learned was something he always did. He and James Marsh built a smokehouse that James had been planning since the previous fall and never found the time for, and he scouted the country to the south and east following whatever information he had about Reese's movements, coming back each evening in time for supper with James and Helena and Lillian around the kitchen table. It was a strange domestic arrangement that none of them commented on directly, but all of them seemed to find natural. And Lillian noticed this with a kind of wondering tenderness that she was increasingly unable to suppress. In the evenings, after supper, she and Levi sat on the porch while the Marshes went to bed early in the way that people waiting for a birth always did, and they talked. They talked for hours, sometimes, about everything. About the state of Kansas politics and the question of land rights and the growing pressure on the Plains tribes. About the best books they had each read. And it turned out they had both read Cooper, and both thought Emerson had something worth sitting with on a dark night. About what they believed happened after death, which was a topic Lillian spent a good deal of practical time with and had developed her own views on. About what they were afraid of. She told him she was afraid of becoming so accustomed to the road that she forgot how to stop. That somewhere in the constant movement was the avoidance of something she had not yet named. He told her he was afraid that his work had cost him the capacity for the kind of trust that intimacy required, that he had spent so many years reading people for threats that he did not know anymore how to simply be with someone without looking for the angle. "You're not doing that with me," she said. "I've been watching for it." He looked at her. "No," he said, "I'm not. I don't know what that means." "Maybe it means something good," she said. He took her hand then, on the porch in the warm darkness with the sound of the river in the distance, and he held it as simply and as carefully as if it were a small animal, and she let him, and neither of them said anything at all. On a Tuesday in late August, 2 days before she had expected it, Helena Marsh's labor started in the early hours of the morning. Lillian was awake and ready before James Marsh had finished knocking on her door. The birth was long, as first labors often are, and demanding, and by noon Helena was exhausted and frightened, and Lillian talked her through it with the steady, unhurried voice she kept for this kind of work, low and even and certain. "You are doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing," she said. "Your body knows what to do. I am right here and I am not going anywhere and everything is going the way it should." The baby was born in the early afternoon, a boy, large and loud from the first breath, and James Marsh cried in the way that otherwise stoic men sometimes do, with the complete surprise of a man who had not expected his own emotion. Helena held the baby with the dazed, radiant expression of someone who has just done the hardest thing they have ever done and discovered they were capable of it. They named him William. Lillian cleaned and settled and made sure both mother and child were well, and she sat with Helena for another 2 hours until she was sure the bleeding had stopped properly and the baby was feeding. Then she stepped outside into the late afternoon sun and stood for a moment with her hands hanging loose at her sides, feeling the particular emptiness that came after a birth. Not sorrow, but a kind of vacancy. The space left when you have poured everything into something and it is over. Levi was sitting on the fence rail near the corral, which was where he had been all day, close enough to be found if something went wrong and far enough away to stay out of the space that was not his to occupy. He looked up when she came out and she saw the question in his face. "A boy," she said. "Both of them are fine." He let out a breath she hadn't realized he'd been holding and stood up and came to her, and without either of them deciding to do it, she walked into his arms and he put them around her and she let herself lean against him for a minute, just a minute, feeling the solid warmth of him and letting the day go. "Good work," he said quietly above her head. "It was their work," she said into his shoulder. "I just stayed present for it." "That's not nothing," he said. "That's everything." She stood back after a while and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the feeling between them had changed from what it had been in the weeks before, or perhaps it had simply stopped pretending to be something it was not. She kissed him. She decided to do it, and she did it, with the same directness she brought to everything, and it lasted only a moment before she stepped back, but it was deliberate and real and had nothing of uncertainty in it. He looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not surprised, not triumphant, not performatively understated, simply open, simply there, as if she had said something he had been waiting to understand and now finally did. "Lillian," he said. "I know," she said. "I know what I said. I'm still not the marrying kind. I still need my road and my work and my own decisions." "Yes," he said. "But I think," she said carefully, feeling her way through the words the way she felt her way through unfamiliar country, "that I have been wrong about something." "What's that?" "I thought that caring about someone meant losing the thing I'd built," she said. "I thought it was one or the other. And I have been waiting for you to confirm that by trying to take something, and you never have." He was very still, listening. "I don't know what this is," she said. "I don't know what it can be given the life we're both living, but I know that it's real and I know that I don't want to ride away from it the way I've ridden away from everything else." "Then don't," he said. "It's not that simple." "No," he agreed, "but most things worth having aren't." They talked late into that night, the way people do when they have finally removed the last fence between them and can see all the way to the horizon. They talked about the practical things, about how two people who both lived by movement and obligation could be in each other's lives. Levi had a job in Caldwell, but it was not a permanent chain. He had been thinking, he said, about what came after the deputy's life, about whether he wanted to spend the rest of his years tracking down men who made bad choices in hard country, or whether there was something else that used his skills differently. He had been thinking about land. He had thought about it for years. A small piece of land on the southern Kansas plains, good grazing near a water source, somewhere a person could build something that lasted. She listened and did not say yes to anything he had not yet asked, but she did not say no either, and that was, for both of them, enough for the night. He found Dalton Reese 10 days later. He had been riding south on information he'd gotten from a Cherokee scout named Tall Fox who traveled the Strip and knew every trail and hollow in the country between the river and the Kansas line. Tall Fox had pointed him toward a dry gulch 8 miles south of the marsh place, where he said a man with a scar across his right hand had been camping with one other rider. Levi went alone, and he came back 2 hours later with Reese's horse on a lead line and Reese himself tied to the saddle, alive and loudly aggrieved, with a cut on his cheek where he had argued with a rock during the arrest. Lillian stood in the yard and watched him ride in and felt the specific relief of someone whose worry has been resolved, because she had been worrying, though she had tried not to show it. "You're in one piece," she said. "Both pieces accounted for," he said, and there was that quiet ghost of a smile. She helped him see to the horses while James Marsh stood guard over the prisoner, and they worked in the easy, matched rhythm that had become natural between them over weeks of traveling together, and she thought about how strange it was to have something feel natural that she had spent years believing was not possible for her. Reese was taken north to Caldwell 2 days later, with Levi and Lillian both riding as escort. He was delivered to Sheriff Baines, who looked at the prisoner with the satisfaction of a man who has been wanting to close a file for some time, and who told Levi he had done good work. Court Hadley met them in the street outside the sheriff's office, his shoulder healed and his manner much recovered, and he shook Levi's hand and looked at Lillian with the frank admiration of a young man who has been informed that the woman who fixed his infection had ridden out after cattle thieves and birth attended and done general good works for the better part of 2 months. "I hear you've been keeping him out of trouble," Court said to her. "The reverse more likely," she said. Court grinned. He was a likable young man, she had decided. He would be good at this job in another few years when the impetuousness wore down to persistence. That evening, Levi told Sheriff Baines he wanted to talk. She did not ask what they talked about, but she knew, because she understood the shape of it. The thing that had been forming in the weeks on the trail had arrived at a point where it needed to be named and addressed, and Levi Turner was the kind of man who addressed things directly rather than letting them sit. He found her at Pearl Garrity's boarding house, where she was once again occupying the same small room she had begun this whole sequence in, and he knocked, and she told him to come in. He sat in the chair by the window, and she sat on the bed, and they looked at each other in the late gold light of the afternoon. "I've told Baines I'm resigning the deputyship," he said. "I told him it would be effective at the end of the month to give him time to find someone." She breathed. She said nothing. "I have some money saved," he said. "Enough for land. There's a section south of Caldwell near Elm Creek that I've had my eye on for 2 years. Good grass, a creek that runs year-round. It needs work, but it could be something." "Levi," she said, "I'm not asking you to give up anything," he said immediately. "I want to be clear about that. You have your work and your route and they matter, and I would never ask you to stop. I'm telling you what I'm planning to do with my own life, and I'm telling you because it involves you, because I want it to involve you, but only if you want that too." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the girl she had been at 19, new to the road and new to her own independence, and how fiercely she had guarded that independence, and how it had seemed at the time like the whole of what she was. She thought about the woman she was now, at 26, who had crossed the Cherokee Strip 3 times and delivered 17 babies and nursed more sick and dying people than she could count, and who had built something real and lasting even if it had no fixed address. She thought about the fact that she had changed, not in the way that meant she was less herself, but in the way that meant she was more. "I need to be able to go when I'm called," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need my own money and my own decisions." "Yes," he said again. "I need to be your equal in whatever this is, not your dependent and not your responsibility." "You've never been anything other than your own equal," he said, with a certainty that was itself an answer. She was quiet. The afternoon light moved on the wall. Outside she could hear Caldwell doing its ordinary business, the sounds of horses and voices and the distant clang of the blacksmith, the world going on with its characteristic indifference to individual moments of consequence. "You said you were not the marrying kind," she said. "I'm not," he said. "Not in the way that means ownership or obligation or any of the rest of it, but I don't think that's what marriage has to be." He paused. "I think it can be two people who choose each other and keep choosing each other and build something together while staying who they are." "Most people would say that's not how it works," she said. "Most people are wrong about a lot of things," he said, and she almost smiled. She thought about a piece of land near Elm Creek. She thought about a place that was hers in the world, not just a camp for the night but an actual fixed point, a place she could come back to. She thought about coming back to it with him in it. She thought about what it would mean to be known by someone, not just passed through, not just seen for a day or a week and then left behind, but actually known over time in all the difficult and unglamorous and real ways that time reveals. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Lillian Whitaker," he said, "will you marry me? Not because the world expects it. Not because you need someone to look after you. Because I love you and you love me and we are both stubborn and capable and alive, and I would rather do whatever comes next with you than without you." The room was very quiet. She stood up from the bed and crossed to the chair where he sat and took his face in both her hands, and she looked at him, this man she had run into on a boardwalk in a cattle town on the Kansas plains, this tired, honest, careful man who had never once tried to make her smaller. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He put his hands over hers where they rested on his face, and he closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them she saw everything she needed to see. They married on a September afternoon in 1879, in Caldwell's small church that nobody used on the weekdays, but that the minister, a gentle old man named Reverend Ames, was clearly glad to see filling up. Pearl Garrity came, and Court Hadley, and Sheriff Baines and his wife, and James and Helena Marsh made the ride north with baby William, who slept through the ceremony with magnificent indifference. Tall Fox, the Cherokee scout who had helped Levi find Reese, did not come to the church, but he came to the celebration afterward and sat in the shade of the livery with a quiet dignity, and accepted the plate of food that Lillian brought to him personally, which she did because she wanted to. It was not a grand ceremony. Nothing about it was grand. But it was real, and it was witnessed, and when Reverend Ames asked Lillian to take this man as her husband, she said "I do" in the same direct, considered voice she had said everything else in her life, and she meant it completely. They bought the land near Elm Creek before the month was out. It was 160 acres of rolling grassland with a creek that ran clean and cold even in a dry year, a stand of cottonwoods along the eastern edge, and a small existing structure that had once been a trapper's cabin, and that they tore down to its stone foundation and rebuilt into something better. The work took the better part of the autumn, and they did much of it themselves, and Levi was better with wood than she had expected, and she was better with a hammer than he had expected, and the resulting house was sturdy and sensible with 3 rooms, and a wide porch that faced west so you could watch the sunsets from it. She furnished her herb room herself. It was the second room in the house, small and south-facing for the light, and she lined its walls with shelves that Levi built to her specifications, and she filled those shelves with her collection of dried plants and tinctures and tins and jars, and all the accumulated medicinal knowledge of 7 years on the road. She put her mother's mortar and pestle on the center shelf, where it had always been, and stood back and looked at it for a moment with a feeling she could not entirely name, except to say that it felt like completion. Levi sold his horse and bought a better one for the land work, and a second horse for pulling the small wagon they acquired, a practical covered vehicle that was better than her old saddle satchel for carrying supplies on her circuit rides. He built a corral for the horses and a small barn that was better than the trapper's cabin had ever been, and he started the long process of learning what the land needed, which was a process that he said, one evening on the porch, felt more honest than anything he'd done in years. She continued her circuit. That had been the understanding, and it remained so, without renegotiation or resentment. She rode out 3 or 4 times a season, usually for periods of 2 to 4 weeks, covering the settlements and homesteads of southern Kansas, and sometimes crossing into the Indian Territory when she was called. She came back each time to the house on Elm Creek, and each time she came back there was a particular feeling of arriving that she had not had before in her life, the feeling that the place she was returning to was genuinely hers in every sense that mattered. Levi was not idle while she was away. He had taken up a part-time arrangement with Sheriff Baines, not as a deputy but as a consultant on specific cases, the kind of work that used his skills without requiring him to be gone for months at a time. He learned the land and the seasons and the rhythms of cattle and grass, and he was a natural at it, with the same patient attentiveness he brought to everything. When she was home, they worked the land together and talked late into the evenings, and slept in the house they had built and woke to the prairie light coming through the eastern window. And it was a life that was both larger and quieter than either of them had expected. In the spring of 1880, Lillian discovered she was pregnant. She had not been planning for it, but then she had learned the most significant things rarely announced themselves in advance. She sat with the knowledge for a day before telling Levi, and she told him directly, the way she did everything, standing at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of morning coffee. He went very still for a moment. Then he said, "How are you feeling?" "Surprised," she said. And then not surprised, really. And then she paused, searching for the honest word. "Glad." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her face with such careful, tender attention that she felt it like a weight in the center of her chest, not heavy but grounding. "Glad," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, and his voice was not even, and she loved him for that, for the fact that he was moved and did not try to hide it. She continued her circuit rides through the first months of the pregnancy, adjusting as she needed to, cutting back by the middle months when the rides became impractical, returning to the house on Elm Creek full-time as her body grew and the autumn came. She used the time to expand her herb room and to correspond with 2 other traveling healers she had met over the years, women like herself who were building practices in the margins of the expanding West, and to write out, for the first time, a systematic account of her remedies and treatments that she had been meaning to compile for years. Levi did not coddle her. She had asked him specifically not to, and he listened, as he always did, and managed the line between attentiveness and overprotectiveness with a care that she found daily astonishing. He asked how she was feeling and accepted the honest answer instead of the reassuring one. He did the heavier physical work without making it into a commentary on her limitations. He read to her in the evenings from the books they had accumulated on the shelves by the kitchen window, and she fell asleep sometimes to the sound of his voice reading Emerson or accounts of Western exploration. And it was, she thought in those moments with her eyes closed, and the fire going and his voice in the room, exactly the right amount of everything. The baby was born on a February night in 1881, a difficult labor by Lillian's own assessment, long and demanding, attended by a midwife from Caldwell named Augusta Reeves, who was excellent at her work, and who did not make Lillian feel self-conscious about the experience of being, for once, on the other side of the process. The baby was a boy. They named him Samuel, for no particular reason other than that it suited him, and he arrived in the world with a considerable amount of dark hair and an expression of grave interest in everything around him that remained characteristic of his personality for years to come. Lillian held him in the early morning light, the house warm from the night fire, Levi's hand on her shoulder. Augusta gone home and the world contracted to this single room and this single fact, and she thought about her mother and the road, and all the years of moving through other people's important moments. She thought about what she had believed at 19, that permanence was a trap and attachment was a loss and freedom meant belonging to nothing. She thought about how a person can be right about something and still be incomplete. She looked at her husband, who was looking at their son with the expression of a man whose life has just rearranged itself around a new center, and she thought that this was what her mother had been trying to tell her, not to be less than herself but to be more, not to give herself away but to let herself be doubled. Samuel grew. Spring came to the Elm Creek land, and with it the first real growing season, the grasses coming up green and thick along the creek bank, the cottonwoods leafing out in their particular cool shade, and clover moving through the meadow with the unconcerned happiness of a horse that has found its permanent home. Lillian went back to her circuit in the late spring, with Samuel old enough to travel in the covered wagon, and Levi riding alongside on those trips that allowed it. And on the trips he could not accompany she rode with a careful planning of distances and destinations, and the reliable network of women in the settlements who would help with the baby while she worked. It was not the solitary life she had lived before, and she did not miss it exactly. She missed the particular clean freedom of moving alone through big country, and she allowed herself to miss it without guilt, because missing something is not the same as regretting what replaced it. She brought life into the world in a dugout near the Kansas-Colorado line in June of 1881. She saved a fever-sick child in a Cherokee settlement in the territory in August, and the elder woman who had taught her the remedies years before, whose name was Standing Water, came to see her and held Samuel and spoke to him in her own language with the easy authority of someone who is imparting something important. What did she say? Levi asked afterward. She said he has good eyes, Lillian told him, and that he will be stubborn. Well, Levi said, he comes by that honestly from both sides. She laughed, and it was real and full, and he laughed with her, and the afternoon went golden around them. In the winter of 1882, Court Hadley came to dinner at the Elm Creek house with a young woman named Ruth, who was the Caldwell schoolteacher's daughter, and who had the clear-eyed, grounded manner of someone who knew exactly what she thought about things. Lillian liked her immediately. Over supper, Court announced that he and Ruth were to be married in the spring, and that he was leaving the deputy job and taking up land of his own on a section north of town. Who put that idea in his head? Ruth said, looking between Levi and Lillian with a smile. About being a lawman one day and a rancher the next. I can't imagine, Levi said. Samuel, who was 14 months old and eating corn mush with focused determination, announced his opinion of the engagement by dropping his spoon on the floor and looking at it with mild surprise. The house on Elm Creek was not large, but over the years it became the kind of place that gathered people. The Marsh family came through in the summer. Tall Fox stopped sometimes when he was traveling north, and he and Levi had developed, over time, a friendship that was careful and respectful and worth having on both sides. Pearl Garrity came for a week in the autumn of 1882 when she was tired of the boarding house and wanted to see the country, and she spent the week eating Lillian's cooking and declaring it superior to her own, which Lillian privately doubted. The second pregnancy announced itself in the late autumn of 1883. Lillian was 30 years old, and she moved through this pregnancy with the different quality of a woman who knows the territory, easier in some ways and more aware in others. The birth was smoother than Samuel's had been, faster and less frightening, and the baby was a girl with Levi's dark eyes and Lillian's auburn hair, who arrived in the early morning of a March day in 1884 with a general air of having decided it was time. They named her Rose for Rosalie, for Lillian's mother, who had carried her knowledge down the Missouri hills and handed it to a daughter who had carried it across the Kansas plains, and who deserved to have her name on something permanent. Levi held Rose in the afternoon of her first day and said, very quietly, looking at her small face with the expression Lillian had first seen when he held Samuel, "Your grandmother would have liked her." "Yes," Lillian said. "She would have." Rose grew. Samuel walked and talked and showed every sign of the stubbornness he had been promised, and also a surprising gentleness with the horses that pleased his father and a curiosity about plants that pleased his mother. By the time he was 4, he knew the names of a dozen herbs and could identify which ones grew along the creek bank, and he brought specimens to his mother with the pride of a junior scholar presenting findings to a senior one. Levi, watching this one afternoon, said to Lillian, "He's going to end up riding your circuit." "Probably," she said, "or building something else entirely. Children have a way of going further than you put them." "Is that a good thing?" "The best thing," she said. The prairie settled around them. The years did what years do, which is arrive and pass and leave their marks. The Elm Creek land improved with every season, the grass managed carefully and the water source protected, and the small herd of cattle they had acquired thriving in the way that good land well cared for allows. Levi was not a wealthy man and did not need to be, and the same was true of Lillian, and what they had was enough in every way that mattered. She never stopped riding her circuit, though it changed over the years as settlements grew and other healers came to the country. She trained 2 young women in the art of the traveling practice, teaching them what her mother had taught her, and they went out into the plains with their own satchels and their own routes and their own steadiness. She wrote out the compendium she had been composing for years and had it printed in a small run in Caldwell, a practical guide to herbal medicine on the Kansas plains that was distributed to homesteads and settlements across the county, and that was, a doctor passing through Caldwell remarked one autumn, the most sensible piece of frontier medical literature he had ever encountered. She gave him a copy and told him the price was fair and watched him ride away with the same expression she had been watching people ride away with her whole life, the expression of someone who has received more than they expected. "You should write another one," Levi said that evening. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it." "What's stopping you?" She looked at him, this man she had married on a September afternoon in a small Kansas church, this man with the dark eyes and the quiet humor and the patience that went all the way down. She looked at their house with the 3 rooms and the wide west-facing porch, and the herb room with its shelves and her mother's mortar and pestle in the center, and at Samuel doing his reading by lamplight and Rose asleep in her bed with her dark-eyed, auburn-haired seriousness, and at the prairie beyond the window with its immensity and its stars. "Nothing," she thought. "Nothing is stopping me at all." She wrote the second book the following winter, at the kitchen table, while the snow came down on the Elm Creek land, and the fire went and Levi read to her when she needed a rest from writing and Samuel helped Rose build something complicated out of wooden blocks on the floor, and outside the world was white and still and entirely, completely at peace. She dedicated it to Lillian Whitaker, who knew that a woman's knowledge was her greatest currency, and to Levi Turner, who understood what that meant. And to the women of the Kansas plains, who built things with their hands and their minds, and their hearts in country that asked everything of them and gave everything back. She finished the dedication on a February evening, in the warm kitchen with the lamplight going gold across the page, and she looked up, and Levi was watching her across the table with the particular expression she had first truly understood on the porch of the Marsh homestead the evening William was born, the expression of a man who sees completely. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand and held hers. Outside, the plains were dark and wide and full of stars, exactly as they had always been, exactly as they would be long after both of them were gone. And the house on Elm Creek sat in the middle of all that immensity like an anchor, solid and warm, belonging to the land and belonging to them, a fixed point in the long and moving country that had made them both. She had told him she was not the marrying kind. He had said neither was he. And they had stood there looking at each other for a long time in the middle of a Kansas creek on a summer afternoon, with the meadowlark singing and the world between them open and unhurried. And what they had been doing in that silence, she understood now, was not hesitating. They had been deciding. They had been recognizing something. They had been choosing, with the quiet and absolute certainty of people who have lived enough of their own lives to know what is real when they find it. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The fire went on burning. The children slept. The stars held their positions over the Elm Creek land, over the Cherokee Strip and the Cimarron and the long flat sweep of the Kansas plains, over all the miles she had ridden, and all the lives she had touched, and all the country she had crossed to arrive at exactly here, exactly this. A life that was wholly her own and wholly shared, both things true at once, both things complete. Outside, the first early crocuses of February were pushing up through the snow at the base of the porch steps, insisting on their existence with the specific, undeniable urgency of things that grow because they must, because growth is what they are, because the world is cold and hard and magnificent and spring always comes. As it had always come, as it always would.